too. All right. Item number 11 is to discuss and make recommendations for the proposed ordinance amendments to section 78-517, the downtown design overlay district requirements. So this is back in front of us again. We're just trying to work through this. And I tried to do a couple things to help you out. Hopefully it didn't confuse you anymore. One was I walked up and down Main Street, took some pictures. They should have been in your packet. If not, we can pull them up on the screen. And then also I pulled some examples of some other ordinances in other places. And I tried to highlight a few things that I thought were relevant. There may have been more that you found. And then also, we had some questions from the Attorney Dragney that we needed to answer in order to move forward. And you'll see on the sheet or on the questions, the question was in black, and then in blue, there were some answers that we had, and then in red were some other answers that were formulated by the city attorney. I worked with Peggy Varigan on the blue answers to try to get a perspective from her because she's much more knowledgeable than I am in this area. And then Attorney Dragney had some responses of his own. So I think the idea is just to kind of go through one by one and try to get these questions answered so we can give some direction to the city attorney on how we want this ordinance drafted. Alderperson Jensen.
I'm going to take this.
Can't hear you.
I'm going to take this way off into left field, if you don't mind.
Well, wouldn't be the first time on this one.
What I'd like to know is what would be the result of us just eliminating the overlay district? I mean, it seems like it would simplify the matter. I understand that the landmarks, of course, would not be in favor of it, but it seems to me that it'd certainly simplify the job that we have in front of us. And if there's buildings that need to be made as a landmark, would certainly encourage the landmark committee or commission, I guess it is, to go ahead and follow through on that process for each of those buildings. But it would seem to me that it would eliminate the issue of what's contributing, what's not contributing. It would just make it much easier for us to do our job here. So I'm just curious as to what would be the result of removing the overlay.
I think I'll make a couple comments and others can jump in. I think what the result would be is we would, if you looked at some of the pictures, and especially the ones that the buildings were remodeled before the historic overlay district was created, you'll see a lot of the buildings where there's siding, some of the original materials weren't used, some of the original designs weren't used, and you'll have a lot more buildings like that. It's be fairly difficult for the Landmarks Commission. It'd be very time consuming and actually would cost some money in order to probably hire somebody to go through and fill out all the paperwork that would be necessary to take all the historic buildings down there and have them designated. And in the meantime, I think what you would see is some of the buildings that are downtown would continue to deteriorate, and it would take away from one of the things that people enjoy about our downtown, and that's the historic nature of it. That's the short answer.
That's why I asked the question.
I think it would become kind of a free-for-all, up until the point where, somebody was able to go through and get the buildings designated. But until that point, people could do pretty much whatever they want. We already have examples of where that's occurred in the past. And for those people that are trying to preserve the historic look of their building and to have the one next to them not use the same guidelines, I think would create some hard feelings.
So you're looking for it's actually trying to create a consistency in the whole district, is what you're saying.
I wouldn't use the word consistency because sometimes consistency is interpreted as everything is the same. And we don't want, I mean, historic districts, and this one is a case in point, they develop organically over time. Not all the buildings were built on the same day, not even the same year. So most of the buildings are representative of the time period in which they were built. So when we're talking about consistency, we got to be careful that we're not talking about consistency in design. We're talking about more consistency in terms of quality, but also, I think, consistency in terms of playing field. The way I typically see communities using an overlay like this, and I think this is the way Stoughton has used it, is that when we look at the zoning codes and the ability of zoning codes to be able to adequately speak to or create a conversation about design quality, even material quality, zoning ordinances, zoning codes typically aren't up to the task. At least the traditional Euclidean zoning that we have. And so an overlay allows you to create a different conversation for a particular geography within the community that allows you to deal with these kinds of quality issues. Now, if our zoning throughout the community dealt with design issues at this level, you wouldn't need an overlay. But the fact is our zoning doesn't. There's communities that have form-based codes, and in that particular context, if you have form-based codes throughout the community, you don't need to have overlay zoning like this because the code structure itself deals with these same exact issues. And so I think that's the main reason, is that the traditional zoning framework, what you can do or can't do with it, just wasn't up to the ability for the community to be able to be part of a conversation or have a conversation about quality within a district.
Should we be looking at making those kind of changes then, instead of trying to rewrite this ordinance to, I don't know, it just
I certainly understand.
seems cumbersome.
I understand your thoughts on it. If this became a local district, as opposed to having each building being a local landmark, then you could accomplish the landmark's goals under the district standards. Because landmarks looks at all the buildings under their control, whether it would be a local district or a specific building, much more critically than the Planning Commission does with the rules that we have. So we're trying to create a zone in which we're applying some standards that are more like the landmark standards, but to have them match what the landmark standards are seems a little clumsy if both groups are really having the same standards and potentially this became a local district. If it became a local district tomorrow, this Planning Commission wouldn't be having to deal with a design downtown overlay district, period. You're right, you'd probably abolish it. So, I think you heard me suggest to Peggy at a previous meeting that in a perfect world, that's probably where we'd try to go, to have that done so that they could identify the characteristics that are inherent under their purview. But absent that, what you're trying to do is say, okay, if that's not going to happen, what level of detail do we have the planning commissioners review this district to? So again, in a perfect world, I think there would be an effort to have it become a local district. Then as part of that creation process, everybody that's in that district understands what's being applied to them. For example, now if we make significant changes to the design downtown overlay district that really match what the Landmarks Commission, has the public process been involved? It's probably shorter and maybe not as inclusive as creating a local downtown design, or local district, local historic district, landmark district. And that's the part that I'm afraid of that we'd miss by making pretty sweeping changes in the zoning code, is now when these rules would become effective under the zoning changes that would be made, the community comes to us with an application and they might be very surprised because there hasn't been as much of a public involvement process specific to them. Now, if there's a local landmark district that's created, there is a process in which notification is made to all property owners and
Yep.
would probably include them more to understand the pros and cons better about the preservation of the district, more so than us doing it at the planning commission.
So it's basically by doing that, keeping the overlay, you're, how do you say it? Well, it's kind of walking a fine line. It's taking something from having it as a district or a landmark district or, and nothing. And you're coming up with something that's going to cover both. Kind of give a middle-of-the-road type approach.
That's, that's true. That's what you're trying to do. How far does the commission think
Yeah.
through zoning we should try to implement landmark standards?
Oh, well, there's a thought.
Anybody else have any questions, or otherwise, I mean, basically how we got here was the council decided to put the moratorium on, I don't know, a couple of years ago now already, and really kind of charged the landmarks to work on the two ordinances, chapter 38 and chapter 78. 38 went through landmarks, was passed by the city council. 78 came here, and we've been working on it ever since. And the goal is to try to get something to the city council so they can ultimately make a decision. And really the question is, how stringent do we want the rules to be if for somebody that wants a downtown building? I think, we want to be reasonable. I mean, we have a few examples where the building we talked about earlier tonight, I think the action that we took was appropriate because it was a non-contributing part of the building and it's going to be an improvement, although there may be some concerns about what it looks like when it's done. And I think that's kind of the idea with the ideas that were on paper here is how far should the planning commission go in the review process and what should the standards be? Should we let them add on whatever he wants to add on, or do we want it to be compatible as was suggested by Mr. Barman? And I think that's kind of the direction that, the council is looking for, and the city attorney is definitely looking for, so he can, complete drafting the ordinance. So what we try to do is break it down to I guess there's 4 points on here, and there's some different elements to each one of them. And I don't know, I thought maybe it'd be easier just to go right down the list and get some feedback and see if there's consensus. Alderperson Jensen.
Could you refresh my memory on this? The building that we were talking about earlier tonight, was that a contributing or non-contributing?
The building itself is contributing.
Right?
Yeah.
It was not a landmark, though?
That's correct.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So
Does everyone understand what we mean by contributing?
I think there's an explanation in the ordinance, isn't there? Doesn't it have a definition in the ordinance, I believe?
I mean, specifically, I think within the context that we were always using it, it's always going back to the National Register of Historic Places district designation.
Yep.
And so, because that's a national and state terminology that's used when you are applying for or requesting designation of a district. And what the State Historic Society and the National Trust or the National Park Service wants you to do is say, okay, go through building by building and tell us which buildings are contributing to the quality of this district that would make it worthy to be designated, and then which ones don't contribute. And all of that has a big impact not only on the acceptance of that nomination and the approval of the district, because if you don't have enough contributing buildings, they're going to just deny it, and you won't be a national district. But it also comes into play when property owners within that district want to take advantage of the tax credits that are available, because you can't take advantage of the tax credits unless you're a contributing building. And so I think we get a little bit, when we talk about contributing, it gets even more money locally here, because, that particular building in question today, even, the building itself is contributing to the National Historic District, but the addition, we didn't consider to be contributing to the quality of the existing building. You know what I'm saying? But the application and nomination in no way specifies the separation between that addition and the larger building. They just considered the whole thing to be contributing. And I think that makes our discussion even more complicated, because when we're talking about partial demolitions, then we're going to have to describe partial contributing. You know what I'm saying? And I can see where this it's a slippery slope for a planning commission, because in most cases, that's not the background, the expertise of the people who are on the commission. That's not why you're here. You're brought on the commission to deal with larger citywide zoning issues, larger development issues. We're not all experts in historic preservation, so I think it makes it more difficult. Whereas the individuals who serve on the Landmarks Commission, they're there because of that expertise. So, like Rodney was saying, I think in an ideal world, it makes the most sense to actually just get off the fence and either decide whether the downtown's going to be a local district within the local opportunities to designate historic properties and districts, or whether it's not. And but in the interim, I think that's why you have the overlay, is to have a conversation about quality in the same kinds of ways we have conversations about quality with planned business developments in other parts of the community, where the zoning class allows us to comment on site plan and comment on materials used for the building and those kinds of things. It's trying to create that same kind of conversation within a downtown without getting too complicated.
I think that's where I was, one of the areas I was coming from, because it seemed to be that there was some redundancy there, and that I wanted to bow to the expertise of the landmarks.
Yeah.
Rather than have us trying to deal with this, as somebody called it, a slippery slope, and
Yeah, I mean, it's just to kind of give you a little background on what I run into in other communities, is that, in a lot of ways, the way this is written is it's written as a design guideline. And a lot of communities will have design guidelines created to educate property owners on how to make good decisions in their own best interest. Because if they make better decisions following design guidelines, it actually increases their property value. It actually, it's to the benefit of the community, but it's packaged in a way that it's good for you as a property owner to know this stuff, because it helps you preserve and maintain the historic building in a way that it actually increases in value. But the guidelines themselves are not mandatory. You have the option to follow the guidelines if you are receiving any kind of municipal or nonprofit incentives. If a community has a facade grant program, if a community has financial incentives, or in some cases it might just be less of a permit fee or expedited approval process. If you follow the guidelines, then you get access to the good stuff. But if you don't want the good stuff, you don't have to follow the guidelines. As soon as you make guidelines mandatory, that's where you start getting into this issue of how are we able to actually enforce the guidelines as regulations, but also are we sidestepping due process, in the sense that if you were to go in and actually designate that district as a local landmark, the property owners would have the right to a hearing. And the right to debate that change. And yet, with the way we're going about this, we don't have,
Right.
they're not in the room. And so I think, early on, the way I recall the conversations is that we really tried to focus the conversation within the overlay district on design quality rather than historic preservation. And I think that makes sense because there's more precedent of that kind of design quality conversation in other parts of the zoning code. And it's not taking it so far that we're doing historic preservation without actually going through the process of designating a district as a local district. See what I'm getting at?
I do, yes.
And so that's the way I've always been looking at the wording within this, is the wording really related to design quality kinds of conversations? And zero setback to me is a design quality. It's not just a historic preservation, although historically there was zero setback. You can have brand new developments that specify zero setback, and you can have brand new developments that specify where signs should be and all that kind of stuff. And so if we look at this from just the perspective of design quality, I think that will help as well, without thinking that we're trying to necessarily just preserve the historic buildings.
Any other thoughts or questions, or where we should go with this?
Well, I'd like to see us run through those 4 questions
Okay.
and see where we get, even just on the issue of demolition, because I think a big part of this is the moratorium. And our comfort level with the overlay district is, and the time it's taking for us to go through this, is extending the duration of the moratorium.
Right. Okay, well, the first question that was on here was, further work is needed to determine the extent to which demolition should be regulated under Chapter 78. Some degree of regulation under Chapter 78 may be desirable, and the following issues require further discussion. So the first question, should only demolition of contributing structures be regulated, or should demolition of non-contributing structures also be regulated? So I think what we're asking is, some of the buildings that are downtown are listed as contributing and some are not. Should we make a distinction? And, the answers that we have is, if we only do contributing, that's fine, because non-contributing is regulated under new construction guidelines in Chapter 78. So in other words, what we were saying when Peggy and I met was, if you only make contributing buildings regulated, if somebody demos a non-contributing, they have to build something that meets our guidelines.
If they build something.
What's that?
If they build something. Then that's been one of the issues. Is
Right. If they
could
build
just
something,
tear
it's
it down
gotta meet the guidelines.
they could tear it down and put, one of the things I think that would help me, because I don't know if this is something that the commission faces on a regular basis, but anywhere in the city, okay, let's just take it outside of the downtown overlay district. Someone wants to tear down their building. All I have to do is go to you as staff, Michael and Rodney, and just say, I want to tear my building down. And then as staff, you guys make them pay a permit, and it's approved, and it doesn't go to commission, it doesn't go to the city council, the building just comes down.
If it's a landmark building, of course, it goes through
Right,
landmark
just
commission.
assuming it's not a landmark.
Okay.
It's not designated locally as historic, it's just, that's someone's house,
And
or
it's
whatever
just-
it might be.
And it's just administrative. One other
Right.
caveat, though, in a historic district, not a landmark building, but a contributing building to the district, then has to be sent off to Historical Society for 30 days worth of documentation
Okay,
before we can issue a permit. So they can photo inventory or whatever they feel necessary in order to preserve the history of the building before it's demolished.
Okay.
So
that's a non-contributing building.
that's a contributing building in a historic district.
Oh, okay,
A non-contributing building in a historic district, we don't have any other process other than local
So,
staff.
Okay.
the real question is do you want to allow a contributing building in the downtown overlay district to be demoed or not?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to see what would happen then. So essentially, if a non-contributing, if we take it out of this, non-contributing building, they would just talk to you guys, you would issue the permit, it would be down, it would never come before the commission, we would just wake up one morning and we would,
Yeah, we
Don't.
can't do that now because of the downtown design guideline requirements, but yes.
But if we make a change along these lines,
Yes.
then it could just come down.
Alderperson Jensen?
Reading through Matt's comments here about this, it sounds like he's suggesting that we don't have any.
Right, that's the other alternative.
What would be the results of that if you just took it away and did not consider non-contributing or contributing as, under the Chapter 78?
And if somebody wanted to tear down City Hall, they could.
I think it'd be a little more tough, a little tougher to do it on City Hall.
Government-owned buildings are.
Yeah, government-owned buildings are
Regulated.
regulated differently, and they're actually local landmarks, so, at least.
So
library.
any non-local landmark building that's downtown. could
Building
be
Cheezers
removed.
is in, someone could come in and just tear it down.
Yep, and they could put up pretty much,
Well, it'd have to meet the requirements of
We
the
still have
currently
to vote.
designed downtown guidelines would have to be met. The other thing that kind of factors in here is the frequency in which that really would, the Cheezers example. The likelihood of somebody coming to take down just that building is pretty slender. But it could happen, but the likelihood is slim. I mean, the one that's on our forefront of our minds is the one that we're considering. It's a freestanding building. There aren't many freestanding buildings in the downtown design overlay district, but those are the ones that are probably more likely to be considered for demolition than one of them that's connected to multiple buildings. I mean, truthfully, the number of requests for buildings to be torn down in the downtown district has been essentially one
Yeah.
that you're kind of considering now, and
Part
maybe
of
a
another
portion
one.
of a building. Aside from the fact when we had, fires that caused damage downtown.
Yeah, and I think that's good, and it's in part because of the quality of the property owners that we have now and the care that they've taken in their building. I will tell you, in communities that don't have any protections in place, I've worked in districts where someone has come in and they've bought up a block and they've gone and removed every other building because they want it to look more like development outside of the downtown district and to provide parking adjacent and off-street and adjacent to the buildings. And it completely overnight changes, it destroys it. I mean, and that's what you're trying to do, is not have that happen and then say, oops, we should have done something before. But, this is the sticky part, is as soon as you define whether or not the overlay district handles demolition or not based on contributing or not, now it makes it a historic preservation argument. Okay, and I just said that it's easier to look at the overlay district if you're just looking at design quality. If you're defining whether the ordinance deals with demolition based on whether a building's contributed or not, it makes it a historic preservation argument. Which, part of me, as a professional within the arena, I want to do that. Because I want, and as a resident of this community, I want there to be some protections for those contributing structures that currently aren't there because we haven't gone so far as to designate the district locally. But if we go down that path, now we're having a historic preservation conversation in an overlay district when we haven't gone through the process, the due process of actually making it a historic district.
Alderperson Seltzer,
Thank you.
or Commissioner.
I'm not sure we're making this more complicated than what I'm reading here, but Rodney, could you move that up a little so D could be read, section D, but still see A? Sorry. No. Okay, yeah. Let me suggest you know, we're acting like everything's broken and we have to start from scratch. But look at A, should only demolition of contributing structures be regulated, or should demolition of non-contributing structures also be regulated? I would say that, let's tentatively think, no. You know, if they're non-contributing structures, let them follow the code. B, how should contributing and non-contributing structures be defined? Let's not try to do that through the city council. Let's let, and I don't know the terminologies as well as I should, but like Landmark Commission or somebody else. I mean, I've looked at it. I was just looking at a property a week ago down at Division and Main Street, and it's an extraordinary historical structure, and it's designated as contributing. So I take that for granted that applies. We've already done some of this. It's already on a chart that shows that. Should demolition of only street facades be regulated? The answer to that is already no, because that would mean if it's just the street facades, all these other questions are irrelevant. It's like we're going to have this Disneyland type prop in the front and tear the hell out of the rest. So now D, I haven't read yet, but I'm not sure we have a broken system yet. I think does the definition of demolition need to be modified? Is the word substantial in the current definition too ambiguous? No, I would say no. I don't see any reason to modify that. We have again, whoever's making these decisions, we have the grounds there for them to make, and they're good, intelligent people, and they care about it, so they'll make decisions. So I don't see A, B, and C, and D being something that we need to fix right now. We're living under it now. So I guess I haven't really looked at some of the rest of it, but you know, and I have built under these regulations in Indiana, and they were very specific in Indiana. You had to have, your appearance from the street was important. You could do anything you wanted inside, and you could do anything you wanted on the back. But there's a lot of things that we could well enjoy being fixed and improved on the backs of some of the contributing structures as well as landmark structures, because they've been added onto in a dangerous and certainly needing renovated way. So I guess that's my thought on all this. I'm not sure everything's broken. We seem to be a pretty good downtown street, but I don't see that several of these questions we aren't fairly well in control of, and maybe modify them just a little bit, but not sure we have a crisis here.
Commissioner Barman and then Jensen.
The design overlay has been in place for how long? How many years?
09?
09.
09. So it's been 8 years. Before that, there was no design overlay. So I think it was just the fact that we had, I think, in large part, good decisions by property owners. Okay. But I think some of the reasons that we are where we are at now is because we've had the overlay for 9 years, and I think there is certainly some issues that are causing some challenges. But here's two thoughts I have. One is I think there might be a way to look at these 4 bullet points within the context of design quality, trying to separate out historic preservation, in the sense that should only demolition of contributing structures be regulated, or should demolition of non-contributing? To me, I think we should decide one way or the other and say we're actually going to have this commission chime in on all demolition from a design quality perspective, or we're not going to chime in on any demolition because we're not going to try to define contributing or not contributing. Okay, and this commission actually did chime in on demolition of a non-contributing portion of a contributing building. And so we can have that conversation at the commission level. It's possible within this district. But I think having it split for number A, that's what's going to cause some of the problems. I also think you can start answering some of these other questions within that same context. Okay, let's stay on design quality, not get mixed up with historic preservation, even though that might be some of our own value systems. That's not where the overlay's at. But my second point, and I'd like staff's feedback on this, we had a situation tonight where we had a proposed change in local zoning that was dependent upon a action by the property owner, and they were given a certain amount of time to get it done if they actually wanted that change to take place. I'm wondering if it wouldn't be a good way or an easier way to look at this overlay is to say, we're gonna fix the overlay as best we can based on our conversations, but we're gonna have a sunset clause on the overlay. And say that, because the overlay is clearly on the fence, and say for 2 years, our fixed or overlay district will be in place, and within that time, then the city has to either decide that we're gonna make the downtown a historic district or not be a historic district. And after that time, then the overlay is gonna go away. And so that gives the community time to decide, okay, is historic preservation important enough that we're actually gonna go through the process to designate this locally or not? And once it's designated, you don't need the overlay. And if it's not important enough to the community, to actually go through the process to try to have it listed, then maybe the overlay should go away anyway. You know what I'm saying? Is that maybe you just have to have, I mean, it's hard to say it's gonna go away now.
Yeah.
But maybe we could have a sunset clause or a time period to say, this ordinance is only gonna be in place for so long, and if something doesn't change, it's gonna go away.
That's a legal question. I mean, certainly there are sunsets to certain standards. I think the one of the things that would be challenging is, in 2 years, would you be back here because it either did get approved or didn't, and evaluating players change. And so commissions change, and people and opinions change, and would we be resurrecting the discussion again now because it didn't happen the way they thought it should, and we did or didn't articulate them well in what got approved or not approved at that point. The community discussion is important to the landmark district process. And I think you might find yourself back here, if the landmark district didn't get implemented, I think there would be some people that are concerned about what isn't or isn't in place to remedy those situations.
Okay.
Now, I think the city attorney's outlined some of his characteristic. I think you've heard my kind of tone about, we have a landmarks commission as a resource that was put in place for the very reason we're talking about this. Not every community has one, and I think we're fortunate to have one. I get it, everybody's volunteer type groups, but that's what the landmarks commission process was put in place for, is to protect those important structures, and in a broader sense, consider whether a district makes sense to protect it in a different manner. Zoning is I'll say, a less than perfect method to do. We're not an architectural review committee by design. There are groups and communities that have that. Go to Madison and you've got some of those things. My concern is if we create something that's fairly fuzzy, people that want to do something with their building won't understand what the expectations are and what the rules are that they're working under. They'll come to us, we'll tell them what we think is right, but if without some fairly good standards, that's what we hear from people that want to either develop or build. If I know what the standards are, I can meet them. If I don't, and I come here and I prepared something and I get denied without understanding what the rules were, they feel like they've not been treated well. Todd, I assume you kind of see that in some communities where the criteria are this, and if you can meet these, they understand what it's going to cost them to make that project work. And then if they get here and they're not approved because they didn't understand them standards, they don't feel like they were treated well.
Okay, we had Alderperson Johnson and then Michael.
Thank you. I want to, in part, echo what Tom was saying. If you look at these, I mean, it's pretty straightforward, A, B, C, D, which way we need to go. As far as A is concerned, I mean, I don't know, I guess with that one, I would rather see us go with contributing only on A. B, we should be consistent with what landmarks is, use the same definition as landmarks does. C, it should be the main street and side street facades. And then as far as D is concerned, demolition is demolition. You know, I think that it's fine the way it is. I think that we have some intelligent people working through here, and I believe that they can interpret what that means. As far as the sunset is concerned, that Commissioner Barman was saying, that's something I'd like to see us pursue too. I don't know if 2 years is enough. I think maybe 3 or 4 years, maybe. But maybe it would give the landmarks the incentive to pursue that. I know that, you know, we could talk about what they would need for a budget to do that. You know, I think it deserves further discussion.
You have some thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, I was just going to suggest that maybe we should toss around just removing the contributing and non-contributing language and just simplify it into just structures. You know, not even get into, like you were saying, the historic preservation part of it. Just call them structures, and we can eliminate a couple of those questions.
That's honestly where I'm leaning, is that under A, maybe under a sunset clause for the overlay, but that we should look at demolition for all structures should come before the commission, not trying to define it, because then B can go away, because we don't have to define it, because that's a historic preservation definition. I would say that when we look at structures, it's not just facades. I've seen too many times where what we call it in the business is a facadectomy, where essentially they prop up the facade, everything else is gone. They build a brand new building behind, and then the community still has their historic skin, and it's just fake history, because you walk in and there's nothing else left. And so to me, at that point, you know, it's not really historic preservation anymore. So I think if we just look at all structures, and if even a partial structure, if it's a square footage that's under the envelope of a building, like the rear addition that was on the building from tonight, then it should be part of the conversation. And so then you don't have to specify a facade or not. And then you don't have to worry about a percentage, because trying to calculate whether it's 10% or 18% or 30%, I mean, if it's part of the building envelope, if it's part of the square footage of the building that is being discussed, versus, I mean, all you're doing is removing aluminum slipcover, I mean, that's not square footage that you're removing from the building. And so maybe that's what we're really looking at, is demolition is really when you're removing square footage.
Square footage, okay.
Or, you know, part of the building envelope versus, because it's not demolition to take off a aluminum siding. That's not demolition. It's not demolition to remove the roof when you're putting a new roof back on. Mm-hmm. But if you're removing square footage, then I think that would come before.
That makes sense.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Does that mean even if you remove it, but you're adding more square footage?
Yeah, because I think you're taking that square footage off to begin with.
Okay.
And during the process of your work, it's gone.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, the we had the fire in the building on Main Street near where I live. And they actually, I think that was a partial demolition in the sense that they removed the old stairwell and part of the second floor, and they rebuilt it back up. So if that was happening in downtown, I think we want to be a part of the conversation, but I imagine that any commission that would be in place would have no problem with that kind of work. So I don't see it holding up development. So where I think this is going to come to a head again, though, is then when you have a proposal that comes before the commission for removal of a whole building, like the one next to the library, and the commission is based on value systems, whatever it is in a different place in terms of whether they want that building down or not.
Right.
And honestly, I think that's the biggest problem with the way the overlay district was written in the past and the way the ordinance was written, is it is the criteria that is used for being able to determine yes or no for demolition is poorly, I think it's, I mean, I'm going to go as far as say poorly written, because it's hard to understand and it's hard to evaluate and it's hard to have any kind of debate on it, because there's no clarity to it. I think the design quality portions of the ordinance, the work that you did, Michael, a couple months ago, to look at how to kind of merge things, I think that clarified a lot of the design quality conversations and put it within the same context in which that we have a lot of the other conversations we have as a commission for new developments in the business park or wherever. It's just that the criteria that are currently laid out in terms of how a commission can make a decision, yes or no, on a demolition, I think that's the even more so than these 4 bullet points, those are the bullet points that are the most challenging for me. So it's not just arbitrary. I want it taken down and you don't want it taken down.
Well, that seems to be the trend, is that, you know, the state is asking us to have some criteria and some justification for our decision-making process. And I think that's what you're kind of getting at here, is we just can't randomly say, well, I don't like that building, so it comes down, or I do like that one, it should stay up, even though the 2 buildings might be identical. And I think that's what gets you into trouble, is when, you know, you're trying to tell 2 different people 2 different things, and it's really the same situation in their minds, at least. And you have to have something to work with, and I think that's where the guidelines were the attempt to deal with that. Just trying to see if we have enough direction here to give the city attorney.
Item 2 really picks up what you've just kind of concluded with, is the demolition standards. You know, how do we articulate the demolition standards?
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to look at any demolition to a physical footprint change or square footage change, what is the criteria that we use to clean up what we have now and make it more understandable? What makes it easier to say yes or no to it?
You have a thought, Greg?
Yeah, so if I understand what was being said is that for D, under the demolition or under the definition of demolition, it would be a reduction in square footage.
A change.
That's what you're saying? Isn't it?
Yeah, it's demolition is removal of square footage or building volume.
Yep.
I mean, we can figure out exactly how to, but it's area under the roof.
Okay, so like in the previous vote that we made tonight about the removal of the non-contributing portion,
Yes.
that's being replaced with more square footage than what was there.
Correct. But as an interim part of the process,
So
they have to first ask to remove square footage before they can ask to put more.
So if we look at demolition of contributing or non-contributing, and that has to come, any of those would have to come to this body. We would have then the option of looking at and determining each individual case.
But then what criteria?
Under what criteria, that's it,
Yes.
yeah.
And you, in the past, I think the criteria has been, I think the desire by some of the community was that the criteria should be, is it a historic structure? Is it a contributing structure? You know, is there, you know, some of those intrinsic values? Those are the reasons why you would say yes or no to demolition. Otherwise, it got into economic feasibility. And the way economic feasibility was defined, I think, was very ambiguous, you know, according to whose, you know, to say that there's no economically viable use for a building, according to whose opinion or whose standards. It's because if I just say, I don't want to put any more money into a building, is that saying it's not economically feasible anymore? So I think if you just have those, a better set of criteria, and I guess I'm not prepared to say what those are, but I think we could probably reach consensus on all four of these. We could probably reach consensus on the design quality kinds of issues. Even tonight, I think the part where I think we might need just a little bit more work is trying to figure out criteria that we'd all be comfortable with, having removed all this other stuff, that we feel comfortable making a decision. Not only that we feel comfortable making a decision about demolition, but I think even the bigger challenge is it's going to stand up in the courts with the changes that we're seeing in the conditional use permits and stuff. I could see where that kind of challenges by property owners to any kind of decision that a body like this makes, they'll challenge anything that we say in terms of no demolition. They'll come back and say, we didn't have the right criteria, we didn't have enough evidence. Burden of proof, my guess, is going to fall on us.
Yep.
So that's going to be the challenge.
So the design criteria would remain the same, or be the same for both contributing and non-contributing in the overlay district? Is the
In
way
terms of design, I think so, because we're focusing on quality, design
Yeah.
quality versus historic preservation.
Just trying to articulate what I think I'm hearing.
Yeah, I mean, that's my opinion.
Yeah.
Because again, it puts us within our comfort level in terms of what we're doing in other kinds of development.
So, not to wrap it into a nice ball, because I don't think we're quite there yet, but the big one is, what are the criteria for demolition? Is that, I think we've started to solidify, at least from what I'm hearing, a general consensus that we're looking at not distinguishing between contributing and non-contributing. And we think that the design criteria should be the same for all the buildings, whatever they are. And the demolition criteria would be the same because you're not looking at contributing or non-contributing. It'd be the same no matter which they are. But those criteria are what are kind of the crux of where we're at right now, trying to figure that out. Todd, are you familiar with any demolition criteria elsewhere? I think before you had discussed repair type conversation before.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with anything related to demolition?
Yeah, I know I've run across it. I tried, I didn't do an exhaustive
Sure.
research, but I can go back into, if this is where we're at, I can go see what I can find. But I know I've run across instances that have done a better job at having a conversation about the amount of money that it would take to bring a building back. I know what the conversation we had at for earlier commission meeting was, even just the cost of bringing it up to code. Okay, so if you look at the cost of bringing up the code versus the cost of, or the value of the assessed value of the property or the appraised value of the property, then you can have at least a conversation with some numbers that that you could crunch. When you start getting into the kind of use, I think that's where you start running into some problems, because, being able to forecast or make decisions about what could be in there or not be in there is a little bit different than looking at just the cost of construction or the cost of rehabilitation. I know one of the things that, in looking through the wording for the different kinds of projects that we've broken out within the ordinance or within the overlay district, just definitions such as not only just repair, but the difference between restoration, rehabilitation, there's that terminology, I think is problematic the way we're using it. I went back and looked at it again, and there's a way that historic preservation field defines what a restoration is versus a rehabilitation versus there's a third, I was trying to find it here in my notes. But I think trying to clarify that a little bit too as relates to repair, I think will then help us to define what numbers you might be crunching in terms of determining whether a building is too far gone. Because that's the argument that you get. The argument that you get is that it's going to cost way too much to make this building economically viable. And I think it is unfair. It's unfair for a municipality to expect a property owner to go in the red, to expect them to have to put money into a building, and then the building will end up being,
Money loss.
yeah, a money loss. Now, there's certainly, property owners make that decision all the time. They make a decision to spend more than the property is worth because they've got another value system that they're coming into play.
Yeah.
And that's their choice. They put 200,000 into it, and now it's only worth 100,000, but they still feel good because they wanted to preserve the building. But for a municipality to expect that you put in twice as much than what you'll ever get out of it, I don't think we can do that.
I don't think anybody expects that.
No, but when you're defining it, I think to say that if it's going to cost you 50% of what the building's worth, that's too much, and now you can go ahead and tear it down. Well, to me, where do you draw that line? Because, just, I think if you put in, it is not, especially for properties that have design quality and are contributing to the overall feel of the district, just because someone would prefer to build a new building and they don't want to put in any money into the building to bring it back, even if that amount, you put it in and you'd have an appraisal done and it would come out in the black, I think that's where a municipality does have a right to have a debate about that and a conversation to say, we can expect you to before we say that it's not economically viable, we can expect the numbers, if they're in the black, to justify us saying, no, we don't want it demolished. Does that make sense? But we just have to figure out how to do those numbers.
Should we look at the proposed language for the demolition part of it?
So, I mean.
Right now, what's in the ordinance is the building or structure is not in good repair. The cost of repairing the building or structure would exceed 85% of the assessed value.
Yeah.
The challenge with that is that,
Parent
if you're just
six.
basing it on assessed value, is that if my guess is, for example, the building across from the library, the assessed value might be low right now because of the condition.
Right.
So I mean, to have it based on assessed value, and assessed value is actually impacted by condition, and you know what I'm saying? That's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're now, through lack of maintenance, the building has deteriorated, the assessed value has gone down over the last few years, and so now that 85% level of assessed value,
Right.
whereas
I would suggest so that your assessed value doesn't change downward
Okay,
automatically.
okay.
I mean, all property owners in town, I see them creeping up. I think very few get cut with any frequency. Maybe I
Well,
should look that one up, just,
The
but,
the other issue is 85%, the cost would exceed 85%. Well, does that include any incentives that you would get to build it? I mean, because in some cases, if it's a contributing building, you could go out and get grants, and you could fix that building for far less.
Well, or historic preservation tax credits.
Right, exactly. So, so the demolition is a tricky one, and then the other one is the standards. If somebody wants to remodel an existing building, are we gonna let them continue, to put siding on a building that is a historic type building in our downtown? And I think that's why the overlay district was created in the first place, is because there was a lot of that going on, and we're starting to lose the historic value down there. And so that's the other part of it, is what standards do you want to use in the design quality? And I don't think we're going to answer that one tonight. I think for tonight, what we need to do is get through the questions that we have and see what the city attorney can do with those, come back at the next meeting, make sure we're good with that, and then work on the design quality or the design guidelines or whatever we choose to do. And that would be our homework assignment.
I'm playing. You guys can continue.
Okay.
You're looking at the history of assessed values?
Not that particular property,
Okay,
but
just-
another one, just.
all
so I
right,
get
that's fair.
one of things.
Okay.
So, I mean, are you guys comfortable with answering the questions that we have in front of us tonight? I mean, I'd like to be able to walk away from tonight to feel like we've at least made some progress, even though I know it's progress
Well,
is hard.
I mean, I can, do you want a motion for answers, or do you want a proposal for answers?
Straw poll, I think, is enough.
What's that?
I think all you need is just a straw poll. Well, what would you feel?
We need to have some direction so we
Yeah.
can draft some language to bring back from the city attorney.
I would just say like, okay, with A then, going with what Todd is talking about, it makes a lot of sense that we consider both contributing and non-contributing, consider it all as one
Mm-hmm.
and the same. So I would say that would be.
So we're gonna treat those as the same.
Yeah, I would say that would be the direction of the
Okay.
commission. And then we just see, does everyone agree to that?
And then you're saying,
No. No, obviously, I
Yeah, no, I
agree with contributing and non-contributing being the same. No.
Yeah.
Non-contributing is not even in the subject matter,
Yeah.
in my opinion.
but for.
Contributing is important because it's giving an extra value to the downtown in general, and that's the whole purpose of it.
But to simplify the process here, and I would agree with you as far as the definitions are concerned, but for the process here, that we would have with the process we need, I think it's simplified by considering both as one. You're not having any difference. So every building down there, except for the landmark buildings, would be.
so you're gonna treat them all as contributing or all as non-contributing?
We're gonna
Treat them all
contribute,
as contributing.
Structures.
we're gonna treat them all as structures within the overlay district,
Right.
and not,
Other than the designated.
yeah, well,
Other than the
it's
landmark.
already specified in the wording now that if it's a landmark, it defaults automatically to landmark.
38.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's already written up, and I think that's been already decided by the commission, so, I think just because, again, that's the way I would move, or the way I would propose, is that, not try to make this a historic preservation argument. Within this context, is that that this overlay is dealing with design quality for all the structures within that geographic district. And not even have the
So
conversation
when you
about
say
the
that, let me take the example of a place with siding on it. So let's say we decided on our design standards that, our design quality, that we don't want any more of that. Somebody comes in and says, well, I want to redo my siding on my building. Does that mean at that point they can put different colored siding? Or do they have to go back to the original state?
I think, I mean, from my recollection, without pulling up in front of me, the way that the current version or the current draft of the ordinance, from a design quality perspective, addresses that exact issue. It addresses the material of the exterior skin or the siding needs to be compatible with existing material. If it's if the material's already in place, then you want to try to at least have if it was wood before, have at least look like wood now and going forward. I mean, I think that's all laid out.
By saying that, you're basically saying that all the buildings down there are going to be treated as contributing.
No, they're going to be they're going to be treated as structures in need of a design quality conversation. It's just like if we were talking about the industrial, I mean, take it out of the context of the downtown. And when we're dealing with development within the industrial park, then we're dealing with all structures within the industrial park. We're not saying we're going to talk about the quality of some of the we're not saying, okay, well, if it's over a certain square footage, then design quality is important. If it's under a certain square footage, then we're not going to worry about design quality.
Okay.
It's all structures that are being proposed.
All right,
We
so
look at design quality.
It's a historic district, but it's also an overlay district.
Yes,
That deals with design.
yes.
So you're saying we're going to treat all structures the same, and we're going to come back at the next meeting and define what those standards are?
Yeah, now, just to be clear, though, we don't necessarily treat them all the same in the sense that the way the current wording is laid out, it talks a lot about context and compatibility. So we're evaluating a building based on what it is. So we have, there's flexibility within design, within the way it's worded in terms of design quality discussion, that if a building was built in 1800 and has a certain material makeup, then you want to look at compatibility from that context, where if the building was built in the 60s and has a different material makeup, or it's located in a different place within a district, the wording currently allows you to deal with that unique context. It deals with compatibility, but it's all from a design quality perspective. It's not saying, because it's historic, you have to do this, and because it's not historic, you have to do this. It's looking at issues of quality of materials, context, compatibility,
Okay.
adjacent buildings.
So what you're saying is anytime somebody has a permit, somebody's going to have to do the research from that time period on that building and figure out what's going to be allowable and what's not.
No, I'm hoping not confusing things in that. I'm sorry if I am confusing things. It's just, you can look at, it's the same way, again, if we were looking at new construction in the industrial park, and we're saying we want quality materials, and maybe in some cases based on a covenant or something that the municipality, in terms of a development agreement, they said we want masonry on the building. So it's all from a design, we don't have to do research on time period. It's just an evaluation of whether or not the material is complementary, compatible. It's from a design quality perspective, not a historic accuracy. And again, that's the difference between a restoration versus a rehabilitation or another kind of structural change.
You think you'll be able to find us some examples of communities that have that language?
No, we have the language already. The language is here already. I mean, and we can call up your pictures, and I can just talk from building to building, if that will help. But when you look at I don't think, from a design quality perspective, I think the verbiage that we've got is good. If you go back and look at, when we're talking about vertical rhythms, when we're talking about the relationship to the street, relationship to the roof of the next buildings, all those things, I think, are laid out pretty clearly with flexibility, in my opinion, without having to be concerned about necessarily historic time period. I mean, Matt, what do you think? I mean, as one of the carryovers from the commission and when we had some of these conversations before.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, and I agree with you. I had been leaning towards just going with contributing buildings as we came into this, but I see it makes more sense to treat them all as structures, and from a process standpoint, treat them all the same, and they all go through the same process and come to here. But then once they come to here, we have the flexibility to look at them for their individual character or contributing factors to the community in downtown. So I think that makes sense to me to look at that, and I think use the guidelines that Michael had worked on as a starting point. We may need to go through them again, and definitely the demolition criteria is what's getting me. I don't know how to set the criteria that we were talking about, but otherwise I agree with you on your responses to those questions.
Rodney, you're kind of flipping through.
I'm just, yeah.
Like when I saw the materials, it said materials should be compatible with the original construction. So if the materials that were used in the early 1900s are going to be different than the materials used if it was built in the 70s. And so you're evaluating a material choice based on, the material that's on the building. So it gives you that flexibility.
So that they use actual 2x4s
Rather than, yes. You bet. So and again, from a value perspective, I would love to be able to separate out contributing, and I think that's what might be where you fall, because there's a higher quality or higher value intrinsic. But again, now that starts to make this look like a historic preservation ordinance, when there's other vehicles that should be used instead. There's more of a, I think, case for having a design quality focused ordinance. But then I think you have to go in, when you're looking at the way this ordinance is even kicked off. It says the purpose, 78517, purpose, the district is intended to preserve and enhance the historical and aesthetic qualities of the downtown. I mean, I think we got to get historic out of that. And just say the district is intended to enhance the aesthetic qualities of the downtown, retain consistent visually pleasing image for the downtown area, something along those lines. With the idea that I would love to have landmarks pursue an official local designation for the downtown.
Yeah.
I think it's needed. But this isn't the vehicle to do that.
That's why you want the sunset, so that.
Yeah,
This would-
to light the
this would-
fire under them. Because what normally happens in a community is what ends up lighting the fire is you end up losing one of the gems, like one of the corner, multi-story buildings like the pharmacy building or something. Someone gets lost for whatever reason. And then people say, oh, now it's too late. We should have had a landmarks effort to designate the district locally. Well, I'm thinking that maybe if you had a sunset clause to this overlay district, that might be the fire that would get people to say, let's do it.
Yeah, we have to check the legality of writing that in
That's
an
right.
ordinance. So, did you have something, Tom?
Yeah, I'm suspect of my own thinking here, because it sounds like we're talking about something from Brave New World or something. We're going to start telling business people how they should build their buildings, and when they put a new facade on them, what kind of material we want them to use. It seems like we're way far away from where we were when this conversation started, and are we really suggesting that the city of Stoughton is going to start approving every remodeling project that has nothing to do with our history or downtown, which was the whole premise, that we were having any standards at all? And now we're talking about what? We're gonna go out to an industrial area and say you need to use this material or that material?
We already are. We already are. We've
Well-
done it just and that's actually what the ordinance has been in place since '09. That's what the ordinance for downtown has been doing. And what this commission has been having to deal with is we've had proposals come before the commission recently within the last 2-3 months where they're just changing the color of their exterior facade and this commission has to weigh in on it. And so it's already there. I mean, we're already doing it.
So maybe I guess, so in this city and generally, and in this area, we are telling everybody who is taking care of property, whether they took care of it well enough, and if they want to change it, whether we agree with the color and material and all that. I've never heard of anything like that, but I'm
For the downtown.
Downtown is much more stringent.
okay, but I thought we were stretching that out to other places and downtown that weren't associated
That was
with-
just examples.
Downtown overlay.
Just downtown.
Oh, okay, well, that's, well, I
What
wasn't quite sure.
Yeah,
but-
what I was,
but-
maybe I was confusing things, but what I'm saying is that there's a precedent for other kinds of zoning classes or
We're gonna take.
other areas of the community where you look at design quality and you have an evaluation of design quality. So I think there's more of a track record and to do that within the downtown district versus weighing in on historic preservation without actually designating it as a historic district. Because right now it's not designated as a local historic district. It's designated as a national historic district, which has zero impact on local land use decisions whatsoever. So-
Okay, well, then I guess basically it's my ignorance of the local city, like you're talking about the overlay, but it just seems like we're getting into nevertheless, a very complex matter of telling people, well,
Yeah.
when you take your siding off, it has to be this color or that
Well,
quality or that,
That's why it's taken us this long to get to this point, because when the original ordinance was drafted, it was pretty boilerplate, but it wasn't drafted with this downtown overlay district in mind. That was something that came after we had the ordinance, and then we found out a couple of years ago, it actually was conflicting with other ordinances, and in some respects, it might have been easier just to start from scratch, but we're trying to conform it, and I think we're almost there. I mean,
okay.
do you think we have enough to bring back at the next meeting?
We're gonna take a stab at what we have.
If you have any thoughts or feedback between now and then, just feed it to Rodney, and he can, clarify.
It'll all be done.
Yeah, he works magic.
Really?
Because what we have to do is we have to run it past the city attorney, we'll run the sunset thing past them, and kind of some of the ideas on where we're at, and hopefully he won't tell us we're all crazy after tonight, but, I appreciate you guys working on this. This isn't really easy stuff, and it's really not what you think you're gonna do when you get on planning commission, but, we'll get through this, and once we
Okay.
do, I think there'll be some clear
Well,
direction.
I'm a newbie, so, I'm trying to catch up
So am I on
here.
this commission, so I'm trying to learn this with you, and,
Okay,
I spent more time on landmarks than I did this one, and trying to separate the two is rather difficult, because we're still talking about the same types of buildings, but yet they're not designated in the same way, and that's what makes it complicated, so. Anybody else, any more thoughts or words of wisdoms?
Yeah, I would just ask that if Todd or if anyone finds examples of more clear zoning codes, let us know, because even reading the ones in the packet and looking at other ones in other cities, they're as messed up as ours are.
They really are.
Down. So it's not an
That
easy
should make you feel
thing.
better.
When we get done with this, they'll be looking at us and say, why didn't you
Yeah,
do that?
I guess if there's interest, I can try to go back and see if I can find more defensible criteria. I mean, other than historic or non-historic as relates to demolition, which is the direction that most communities go when they're trying to stop demolition, is it's a historic choice.
Right.
To do it from a design quality or an economic development kind of criteria, I'll see if I can find something along those lines to at least give us something to look at.
And there was one in the packet tonight that they required, and then they quote, required the owner to pay for a independent study for an economic analysis. I think that's going a little far, but
Yeah.
yeah, if he's finding good criteria, it'd be good, but.
It's not only, it's not only a big expense, but then the result is so dependent upon who they hire. And again, ultimately, according to the way that the state seems to be working, the ultimate burn-up proof is gonna end up coming back to us anyway. So, yeah. So I think there's probably easier ways than that.
I hope so, yeah. All right, is there a motion to adjourn?
Yep, you got it.
Second?
Motion by Justin, second by Bartlett. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you.
Ronnie, did you find a case where property values went down due to maintenance?